I never imagined that the hardest year of my life would end with me sitting on the floor of my art studio holding a painting of my own garden made by someone who had never learned how to paint. But that is exactly where December of 2019 found me. My name is Maya. I am 28 years old. I teach watercolor in East Nashville, Tennessee, and I had just lived through the kind of year that takes everything you thought you knew about yourself and lays it out on the table and asks you to decide what you are actually keeping. I had decided, and what I was keeping was standing at a bus station on the other side of the city, coming back to me on a ticket dated December 23rd. The box had arrived at the studio 11 days before that. No return address, mailed from New York City, the postmark showing it had been sent 18 days before it reached my hands. Inside was a watercolor painting on notebook paper of my back garden, the fern by the gate, the old dogwood tree, the wooden bench where we had shared so many cups of coffee. Painted from memory, imperfect in every technical sense, and more intentional than anything I had ever received from anyone. On the back, one sentence in Skylar's handwriting. I am not going to repeat what it said because it belongs to me, but I will say it was the truest and simplest thing anyone had ever written to me, and it fit on one line without trying. In the days between receiving that box and December 23rd, I painted more than I had in any other stretch of the year. Not because I had commissions to finish or students waiting. I painted because it was the only thing that made the hours pass at a speed I could tolerate without checking my phone every 15 minutes. The studio walls filled up with new work that week, pieces that were different from anything I had made before, colors more saturated and less careful, compositions that broke my own rules in ways that felt right rather than wrong. I understood later that I was painting like someone who had stopped being afraid of using the wrong color. Skylar and I had been talking every day in those weeks leading up to her return. Not the careful, short messages of October and November, the ones that felt like two people tiptoeing across a floor they weren't sure would hold them. These were real conversations, the kind that started in the afternoon and ran past midnight. Her telling me about the last weeks in New York City, me telling her about the studio and Indigo and Nashville going into the cold of December, that Goiânia never quite gets, but Nashville absolutely delivers. She sounded lighter every day, like someone who had been holding her breath for 3 months and was finally practicing exhaling again. On a Wednesday afternoon, she called instead of texting, which she started doing more in those final weeks. I picked up on the first ring, which was information she did not need to have but got anyway. Her voice had that particular ease in it that I had missed, without fully admitting I was missing it. She told me she had played her last show of the contract the night before, that Liam had tried to extend for 2 more months, that she had said no without hesitating. I asked if saying no had been hard. She was quiet for a second and then said, "It was the easiest thing I did all year." I held that sentence for the rest of the day. 2 days before she arrived, my mother Vera showed up at the studio without calling first, which was not something she did. She came in with a container of food she had made, the lasagna I had loved since I was a child, put it in my refrigerator without ceremony, and then stood in the middle of the studio, looking at the paintings on the walls with an attention that was not casual. She stopped in front of the watercolor painting of my garden that Skylar had mailed, and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she turned to me and said something I had not expected. She said my father wanted to talk, that he had been trying to write a message for 3 days, and kept deleting it, and had finally asked her to come instead. I went to my parents' house the following afternoon. My mother opened the door, held me a beat longer than usual, and went to the kitchen to give us space. My father was in the living room in his chair, the one that had always been his, with his hands on his knees, and an expression I could not fully read. Not anger, not coldness. A man of 62 years trying to find the path between what he had been taught and what he felt for his daughter. The conversation was hard and honest and did not resolve everything, but at the end of it, he said something I had not known I needed to hear. He said, "You are my daughter, and that does not change." It was not complete acceptance. It was a crack of light under a door I thought had closed permanently. And in that moment, a crack of light was everything. I drove home from my parents' house in Germantown with that particular tiredness that comes after something difficult and necessary. Sat on the back porch with Indigo and watched the Nashville December sky go gray above the rooftops. Picked up my phone and sent Skylar one message. "My dad and I talked today." She responded in under a minute. "And?" I wrote, "He said I'm his daughter, and that doesn't change." 2 minutes of silence. Then an audio message. Just her taking a slow breath at the start, and then her voice very quiet. "Maya, that's everything." I listened to it 4 times. That night I could not sleep for a reason that was entirely different from all the other nights I had not been able to sleep that year. It was not the weight of the dinner table, or my father's silence, or the uncertainty of what came next. It was something lighter and faster, and more physical than any of that. It was the night before. It was the specific electricity of knowing that the following evening, Skylar would step off a bus at the Greyhound station on 8th Avenue in Nashville, and I would be standing there. We had not made plans beyond that. We had not talked about what the meeting meant, or what came after. We both knew. And sometimes 2 people knowing at the same time is enough. On the morning of December 23rd, I woke before my alarm. 6:15, the Nashville sky still dark outside my window, the cold that Nashville does properly in December already pressing against the glass. Made coffee, watered the plants, talked to Indigo. The same routine as every morning. Except nothing was the same as every morning, and I had known that since the first second I opened my eyes. I looked at my back garden through the kitchen window, the same garden Skylar had painted from a New York City apartment, and thought about the fact that it would be the first thing she saw when she arrived. Went to the studio early and straightened things with the specific care I had learned to recognize in myself as the quiet language of someone preparing for someone important. The bus from New York City arrived at the Greyhound station at 6 in the evening. I had 12 hours to wait. I painted through the morning. The afternoon was harder, and at 5 o'clock I locked up the studio, changed my clothes, got my keys, and left. On the drive across Nashville, the city was full of the particular energy of December 23rd. People carrying shopping bags, traffic heavier than usual, the smell of someone's fireplace cutting through the cold air when I stopped at a red light on Broadway with the window cracked. I was in the middle of all of it, and I was not seeing any of it. I was just arriving. The Greyhound station on 8th Avenue in Nashville on December 23rd is not a quiet place. Families with oversized bags, children running between adult legs, the smell of bad coffee mixed with something fried from the vending area, the overhead speakers announcing arrivals and departures on top of all that simultaneous conversation that stations carry like a permanent soundtrack. I got there 20 minutes early and stood near the arrival area with my heart doing something I had stopped trying to manage and was just allowing. The board showed the bus from New York City running 18 minutes late. Of course it was. I stood in that loud space staring at the departure board like looking harder would change the time. A woman beside me was holding a handmade sign that said, "Welcome home, son," in red marker letters. An elderly couple nearby held each other's hands waiting for someone. A small child was asleep against his father's shoulder with his cheek pressed into the fabric of the man's jacket. I looked at all of those people and thought that everyone in that building was waiting for someone who mattered. That bus stations were essentially structures built to hold the specific weight of human anticipation. The board updated. Revised arrival 6:47. I sent Skylar a message. "I'm here." She responded immediately. "I know. I can see Nashville coming in through the window. This city looks different coming back than it did leaving." I held that message for a long time. That one sentence told me more about how her 3 months had felt than any conversation we had managed over the phone. At 6:52, the arrival doors opened and the first passengers started coming through. Families reuniting, that collective exhale of people who have been traveling and are finally done traveling. I moved slightly closer to the barrier without realizing I was doing it, scanning faces. And then she came through the doors. Large backpack on her shoulders, a canvas tote in her hand, her dark hair loose the way I liked it best. Her left wrist with the small wave tattoo visible because she had her sleeve pushed up despite the December cold, in a way that was completely characteristic of her. She saw me before I managed to say anything. Skylar stopped for just 1 second when our eyes met. 1 second. Then she walked straight to me with that calm of hers that had always disarmed me, set the tote bag on the floor, and without a single word, she put her arms around me. Not the hug of someone arriving from a trip. The hug of someone who had been missing something specific and had finally found it again. I put my arms around her and stayed there, in the middle of the loud Nashville bus station on December 23rd, not caring about a single thing happening around us. She was shorter than I sometimes remembered when we went days without seeing each other. That was one of the small things I had stored about her, that she was shorter up close, and that when she hugged me she tucked her face near my neck, and I could feel her breathing slow down. In that hug at the station, I felt exactly that. Her breathing slowing, like she had been moving at the wrong pace for 3 months and had only now found the right one again. When we pulled apart, she looked at me for a moment with an expression I recognized from all the times she had looked at me and meant more than what she was saying out loud. Then she said, "You cut your hair." I had trimmed about 2 inches a few weeks back, something almost no one had noticed. I said yes. She said, "It looks good," and smiled. Not the half smile, the full one. I felt that smile in my chest the way I always had, and I realized I had spent 3 months missing exactly that specific thing, without having words for it, until it was right in front of me again. We walked out of the station slowly, her with the big backpack and me carrying the tote she had set down, and outside the Nashville December cold hit properly. That clean cold that the city does well, a world away from the Nashville heat she had left in September. She stopped on the sidewalk outside the station and breathed in for a moment with her eyes closed. When she opened them, she said, "Nashville smells different." I asked how. She thought for a second and said, "It smells like somewhere I know." On the drive to the studio, she sat in the passenger seat, and we talked about nothing important for the whole 25 minutes, and it was exactly right. She asked about Indigo. I told her he had knocked over a jar of cobalt blue 2 weeks earlier and had walked around with a faintly blue left paw for 3 days. She laughed her low laugh. I asked if she was hungry. She said she had eaten something on the bus but would absolutely take a coffee. It was the most ordinary conversation 2 people could have after 3 months of distance and 1 serious unresolved argument and a hand-painted garden mailed across state lines with no return address. And it was perfect, precisely because it was ordinary. We pulled up to the studio just after 7:30 in the evening. I unlocked the garden gate and let her go in first. Skylar stopped in the garden before going inside and stood there taking it in. The fern by the gate, the old dogwood in the corner, the wooden bench. I stayed by the gate watching her look at the garden she had painted from memory in a New York City apartment, and I understood in that moment what she had actually done when she made that painting. She had not painted a garden. She had painted the place that felt like home when home was 500 miles away. She turned to look at me with an expression I had never seen on her before and could not fully name in the moment. Not happiness exactly, not relief exactly. Both of those things combined with something else that had no single word for it, but that I recognized because I was feeling the same thing. She said very quietly, almost to herself, "I didn't know I missed this place this much." I said softly, "I knew." She looked at me, and for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. The only things that existed were that December garden, the Nashville cold, and the 2 of us standing finally in the same place. I made coffee while Skylar walked through the studio, reacquainting herself with every corner. She did it slowly, the way she had done the very first time she came to look at the space for a photo shoot, stopping in front of each painting like she was reading something. But this time was different from the first time. This time she knew every one of those paintings, knew which ones had been made on good days, and which ones on hard ones, because I had sent her photos of almost all of them during the 3 months. Watching her move through the space in person, touching lightly the edge of a frame here and adjusting a misplaced brush there, gave me a feeling I can only describe this way. It was like searching for a word for a very long time and having it simply appear. She stopped in front of the new canvas I had painted in the second week of December, the one with the boldest colors, the burnt orange, and the deep red, and the blue I could never mix twice exactly the same way. She stood looking at it for a long time without speaking, then said without turning around, "This one is different from the others." I told her it was. She asked when I had made it. I told her I had made it the same day I decided I was going to ask her to see me for real when she got back. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned and looked at me with that expression I knew, the one she used when she was choosing words carefully because they mattered. She said, "I wrote 11 letters in New York." I stood still with both coffee mugs in my hands. 11 letters. She continued, "I didn't send any of them. I would write one and then keep it, because sending a letter felt like too much, you know? But every time I tried to send a normal text and kept deleting it because I couldn't fit what I needed to say into a text message, I wrote a letter instead." She went to her backpack, opened the front pocket, and pulled out a folded envelope. Not a real envelope. One made from notebook paper folded carefully the way you do when you need to keep something but don't have the right container for it. She set it on the studio work table. This was the one I was going to send. The other 10 stayed in New York. I set the coffee mugs on the table and picked up the envelope with a carefulness that said everything about what I was feeling. It was unsealed, just folded closed. Nothing glued, nothing permanent, as if she had wanted it to be easy to open when I was ready. I looked at her before opening it. She gave the smallest nod, a gesture that said, "Go ahead without needing words." I opened it. Her handwriting was exactly the kind that revealed the person behind it. Large letters, slightly tilted to the right, words pressed together at the start of each line and spreading out toward the end, like she began each sentence with intention and forgot the intention somewhere in the middle. The letter was not long. 3 paragraphs. I read it once. Read it again. On the 3rd paragraph, my vision blurred in a way I let happen without trying to stop it. I am not going to share what it said because that letter is mine. But I will say, she had written it with the specific honesty of someone who has nothing left to lose by telling the truth, and that nothing she could have said out loud would have landed with more precision than what was on that page. When I looked up from the paper, she was watching me with that quiet, attentive expression she had, the one she used when she was waiting without pressure. I folded the letter back carefully, slid it into the envelope, and held the envelope against my chest for a moment before setting it on the table. It was a completely involuntary gesture, and I did not regret making it. Skylar smiled softly when she saw it, not with amusement, with recognition, like watching someone do exactly what she had hoped they would do. I said, "You should have sent it." She said, "I know. I was scared." I asked, "Of what?" She took a genuine pause, not the kind of pause someone takes to formulate a strategic answer, the kind where they are actually checking the answer inside themselves before speaking. Then she said, "That you would read it and decide I wasn't worth all the complicated parts, that it was easier without." I looked at her for a moment and then said the simplest and truest thing I could find. It was never easier without. The coffee had gone cold. We drank it that way anyway, sitting across from each other at the studio work table, the letter between us and Indigo, who had materialized from nowhere and was now investigating Skylar's backpack with the gravity of a professional inspector. She lowered her hand toward him, and he sniffed her fingers with great suspicion for about 4 seconds, and then pressed his head into her palm, like he had decided she was forgiven. Skylar laughed at that with a lightness I had not heard from her since before August. "He tested me," I said. "He always does." You passed. The evening settled in around us while we stayed there. No agenda, nothing scheduled for that night beyond being in the same room after so long of not being in the same room. She told me about New York in more detail than the phone calls had allowed, about the size of the city that sometimes made her feel small, about the shows that had been good and the ones that had felt hollow even with a full floor, about the apartment Liam had arranged where she had tried to recreate the colors of the studio with drugstore paint and failed completely, and found it funny rather than sad by the end. Somewhere after 10 o'clock, she stopped in the middle of a sentence, looked around the studio with that expression she had when she was thinking out loud before speaking, and said, "I don't want to stay in a hotel this week." I stayed quiet, waiting. She looked at me directly. "I'm not asking for anything you don't want to give, but if there's a corner here or at your place, I would spend this week in Nashville differently than I would in a hotel room waiting for Christmas to pass." I looked at her for a moment that was brief because the answer had been ready before the question finished. I said, "There's a corner." Skylar stayed at the studio. Not at my apartment, not in a way that was more than what she had asked for. She slept on the wide couch at the back of the space, the one covered with the knitted throw blanket my grandmother had made years ago, with indigo installed at her feet like he had always lived that way. On the morning of December 24th, I woke early as usual, made coffee, and when I opened the studio door to let in the cold morning air, I found her already awake, sitting on the back garden bench with her knees pulled to her chest, and a mug she had made herself, looking at the garden with the particular stillness of someone who has been sitting there long enough to have stopped thinking and started just being. She heard me come out and turned. She had sleep marks on her cheek, and her hair in a state she would not have chosen for any other circumstance, and she was wearing that expression she had in the mornings, before she had decided to be fast about anything. She said, "Your garden looks different in the morning than the garden I painted." I asked what she meant. She said, "The one I painted was my memory of it. This one is the original. It's better." I sat down beside her on the bench with both mugs and looked at the garden, trying to see what she was seeing. It was the same garden it had always been, but with her beside me it felt larger. Christmas in Nashville carries its own specific weight that December 24th makes unavoidable. The cold that finally feels seasonal, the smell of something cooking drifting from every house on the block, the particular quiet of a city that has slowed down for one day and doesn't apologize for it. My mother Vera had invited me to Christmas dinner at my parents' house in Germantown, and I had accepted before Skylar arrived. That morning on the garden bench I sat for a while without knowing how to bring it up, so I simply brought it up. I told her there was Christmas dinner at my parents' house at noon, that she was not obligated to anything, that I completely understood if it was too soon for something like that she could stay at the studio, and I would be back by mid-afternoon. She listened to all of that while looking at the garden, and when I finished she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you want me to come?" I could have given a diplomatic answer. I could have said it was her choice, that there was no pressure, that it was complicated. I said none of those things. I said, "Yes." She nodded once slowly. "Then I'll come." We arrived at my parents' house in Germantown at 12:10. My mother opened the door, and when she saw both of us, her expression did the work of staying composed. That specific effort of someone who had decided in advance to be gracious, and was honoring that decision in real time. She said hello, said Skylar's name with a steadiness that I knew cost something, and opened the door wider for both of us. Skylar said thank you with that calm voice of hers, and stepped inside without making the moment any larger than it needed to be. My father was in the living room. When we came in, he stood up, which was his way of showing respect regardless of anything else he might be feeling. He looked at Skylar for a second that was honest in its complexity, not hostile, not warm, but present and real, in a way that was already more than I had been certain he could manage. He said good afternoon. Skylar said good afternoon, Pastor Gerald, with a steadiness that I could only fully appreciate afterward, because I understood how much weight that moment carried from both sides. My father nodded slightly and went to the back porch. It was not perfect, but it was a beginning that none of us had been certain was going to happen. Christmas dinner had layers. On the surface, holiday conversation. My mother's cooking, which was always exceptional. My father saying grace before the meal in his familiar voice. Underneath, a collective awareness that this table was being something new and that everyone present was navigating that in the way they could manage. Skylar did not try to win anyone over, did not perform effort, was not too quiet or too present. She was simply herself, and somehow that was more disarming than any strategy could have been. In the middle of dinner, my father asked Skylar, without looking directly at her at first, what she did for work. She explained about the music, about DJing, about what it meant to build a career in Nashville, doing something most people her mother's age did not understand as a real profession. He listened with an attention I recognized as genuine rather than polite. He asked a follow-up question about how she had learned, whether she had studied formally or taught herself. She told him about her mother Teresa, about the equipment bought in installments, about the years of trial before anything felt solid. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "You built that yourself." It was not precisely a compliment. It was an acknowledgement. But coming from my father, who valued above everything the work a person constructed with their own effort, it was more than a compliment would have been. After dinner, my mother called Skylar into the kitchen under the pretext of help with dessert, which was transparently a pretext because my mother had been cutting her own desserts, without assistance since long before either of us existed. I stayed in the living room with my father. We sat in a silence that had years inside it, the particular silence of a father and daughter who know each other well enough to know when words are coming. Then he said, looking at the window rather than at me, "She seems like a serious person." I told him she was. He nodded, said nothing more. But when Skylar came back from the kitchen with the dessert plates and my mother behind her, I watched my father produce a small, involuntary smile at something Skylar said as she set the plates down, a smile he had not planned and did not catch in time to contain. And that unplanned smile said more than any prepared speech any of us could have delivered. We left my parents' house in the early afternoon. At the front door, my mother hugged both of us, me first and then Skylar, with a firmness that I recognized as her language, for things she did not yet have the right words for out loud. My father stood in the doorway and said good afternoon when we left. Skylar said good afternoon, Pastor Gerald, in the same tone as before. He nodded, and when I glanced back from the sidewalk, he was still standing in the doorway watching us go, with an expression I could not completely read, but that had no hostility in it. Just a man trying, the way he had promised he would. On the walk back to the studio, we went on foot because the afternoon asked for it. That particular Nashville cold that is bracingly clean, rather than punishing when the sun is out. Skylar walked beside me without speaking for a stretch and then said, "Your father looked at us differently when we were leaving." I said I had noticed. She asked what I thought it meant. I thought about it genuinely before answering. I think it means he is trying to understand something he was not raised to understand, and that for love of his daughter he is willing to try. Skylar was quiet for a moment, walking beside me, then said very softly, almost to herself, "That's a lot." I said, "It's everything." The days between Christmas and New Year's have a quality that is specific and hard to describe accurately. They are not quite holiday and not quite regular days. They exist in a parenthesis the calendar invented so people could breathe between one significant thing and the next. In 2019, those days were the most quietly beautiful I had experienced in the entire year. Skylar stayed at the studio, woke early even without reason to, sometimes made coffee before I arrived, and we built a rhythm of days that had no obligation in them and were rich precisely because of that. On the morning of December 26th, I arrived at the studio and found her already attempting to paint on her own. She had taken a sheet of watercolor paper from the block I always left open on the work table, had separated 3 colors with no apparent system, and was sitting with the brush in her hand staring at the blank page with a seriousness that made me stop in the doorway just to watch before she noticed me. The tip of her tongue was slightly out in concentration, that habit of hers that she did without knowing, the one that appeared when she was most completely present inside something. She felt me arrive and looked up without changing the serious expression. She said, "I'm trying to paint the bus station." I went to the table and looked at what she had made. It was a blue wash with something that could generously be interpreted as a ceiling if you had significant goodwill and prior knowledge of the subject. I said, "It's really good." She gave me the look she gave when she knew she was being spared the full truth. "Maya," I said with a straighter face, "it's very expressionist." She laughed her low laugh, and I felt it in my chest the way I always did, and it never once became ordinary no matter how many times it happened. We spent that morning in the studio together, her painting what she called abstract studies, and I called disasters with intention, me working on a new canvas that had been calling me for days. There was a quality of silence in those hours that I did not have with anyone else in my life, not the empty silence I had constructed for myself in the 2 years after Ryan, not the uncomfortable silence of two people without anything to say. It was the silence of two people who were completely at ease existing in the same space without needing to fill every second with conversation. I had read about this kind of silence in a book once and thought it sounded like something invented for fiction. Now I knew what it actually sounded like. On the 27th, she asked if I wanted to go visit her mother, Teresa. The question arrived with a directness that did not give me time to formulate a rehearsed response. Skylar explained that Teresa knew she was back, that they had spoken on the phone, and that she had mentioned she was staying with a friend. A friend was the vocabulary Teresa used when other words were not yet available to her, and Skylar knew that, and I knew that she knew. I said I wanted to go. She looked at me with an expression that had gratitude inside it, the quiet kind she carried without ceremony. Teresa's apartment was in a building near downtown Nashville, one of those older brick buildings with a lobby that smelled like the 1980s and an elevator that worked inconsistently. We took the stairs. Teresa opened the door with the expression that belongs to mothers who love their children but do not always know how to show it without stumbling. A mixture of relief at seeing Skylar back and caution about what Skylar had brought with her. She was shorter than I had imagined from everything Skylar had told me, with silver-streaked hair cut close, wearing a house dress and a kitchen apron she had clearly forgotten she had on when she came to answer the door. She said, "Come in," and opened the door wider. The apartment was small and immaculately kept, the kind of kept that belongs to someone who does not have much space and takes care of what they have with attention. There was a photo of Skylar on the hallway wall, maybe 8 years old, with a smile I recognized immediately because it was the same smile Skylar had when something genuinely surprised her in a good way. Teresa led us to the living room, brought out sodas she poured into tall glasses without asking what we wanted, and sat across from us in the armchair with her hands in her lap. The conversation started where these conversations always start, on safe ground. Teresa asked me what I did, and I told her about the studio, the watercolor classes, East Nashville. She said she had never been inside a painting studio in her life. Skylar said my studio was good, that she had tried to learn there. Teresa looked at her daughter with a contained smile that was clearly involuntary. Sophia always needed to learn everything the hard way. Skylar said, "I still do." Teresa said, "In that, you are exactly like your father." A brief silence followed, the kind that carries history that did not fit into the conversation. At some point, Teresa went to the kitchen for something, and Skylar and I had a few minutes alone in the living room. Skylar leaned slightly toward me and said quietly, "She's trying." I said I could see that. She said, "For her, this is a lot." I said I understood. And I genuinely did, because I had a father who was also trying, and I knew the specific weight of receiving someone's effort when the effort is real, even if it is imperfect and slow. When Teresa came back from the kitchen with a plate of cookies she had made that morning, she set them on the coffee table and remained standing for a moment before sitting. She looked at me directly with an expression I recognized as her version of courage. She said, "Skylar is very private about what she feels. Always has been. If she brought you here, it means you matter." It was not a blessing, not a full declaration of welcome, It was a mother telling the truth about her daughter to someone she was still in the process of evaluating. I received it with the care it deserved. I said, "I know, and I take that seriously." Teresa looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded once, slowly, and reached for a cookie. And that was enough. We left Teresa's apartment an hour and a half later. In the elevator that worked on the way down, Skylar stood quietly with her eyes on the closing doors. When we got to the lobby and stepped out into the Nashville cold, she took a slow breath of the outside air and said, "Thank you for coming." I said it had been good to be there. She said, "It was different than I expected." I asked what she had expected. She thought genuinely for a moment. "I expected it to be harder. For you." I said, "It wasn't. She loves you. That's visible in everything she does, even the things she does wrong." Skylar walked beside me in silence for a full block, then said very quietly, almost just to herself, "I know. It took me a long time to understand that." I did not say anything. Sometimes the right thing is just to keep walking beside someone. December 29th fell on a Sunday, and the morning arrived with a light that Nashville does sometimes in winter when it decides to be generous. Soft and low, and coming through the studio windows at an angle that turned everything it touched a pale gold. The garden outside still had frost on the wooden bench at 7 in the morning, which was a thing Nashville December could do that Goiânia never quite managed. I woke before Skylar as usual and stood in the studio doorway for a moment, looking at her asleep on the wide couch, with indigo, a warm orange shape curled against her feet, and the knitted blanket pulled up unevenly the way it gets when someone has been sleeping well. There was something very still and very significant about that moment, and I did not want to disturb it, so I went to make coffee in the small studio kitchen as quietly as I could manage. She woke up with the smell of the coffee, which I had learned about her early on, that the smell of coffee accomplished what no alarm could. She appeared in the kitchen doorway with her eyes still at half capacity, and her hair in the honest state of someone who had slept deeply and had not yet made any decisions about the day. I filled her mug and handed it over. She took the first sip with her eyes still not fully open and made a sound of involuntary approval that made me smile before I could decide not to. She noticed and said, "Don't say anything." I said, "I didn't say anything." She said, "You were thinking loudly." And I went out to the garden before she could see that I was still smiling. We spent the morning without plans, which was my favorite version of any morning. Skylar settled into the garden hammock I had strung between the dogwood and the fence post, with a book she pulled from the studio shelf without asking, which was a familiarity that pleased me more than I expected it to. I painted near the open window with the low music she had put on before going to the hammock drifting through the cold air. At some point during the morning, she read a passage out loud with no introduction, just because she had found it interesting, and I responded without putting down my brush, and we went back and forth like that for a stretch of time, exchanging fragments of thought across the space between the window and the hammock, like it was the most natural conversational structure in the world. In the early afternoon, she set the book on her chest and stared up at the hammock netting for a while, in the particular stillness that was not relaxation, but elaboration. I had learned to recognize that stillness as the one that preceded something she had been thinking about for longer than the current moment. After a while, she said without moving, "I need to tell you something I didn't tell you properly before." I set down my brush. She kept looking up at the hammock netting. "The 11 letters. I brought all of them." I went still. She continued, "They're in my backpack. You don't have to read them. But I didn't want to leave them in New York because they felt like yours even though you had never read them. I don't know if that makes sense." I told her it made complete sense. She turned her head in the hammock to look at me. "Do you want to read them?" I said yes. She said, "Not today. Whenever you're ready." That afternoon, Cassie showed up at the studio without warning, which was entirely characteristic of her. carrying 2 sodas in a paper bag and wearing the expression of someone who had planned to look like she had not planned anything. She knew Skylar by name and story, but they had never been in the same room. When I introduced them, Cassie shook Skylar's hand with a firmness that communicated considerably more than a handshake needed to, and Skylar received it with a smile that showed she understood exactly what was being communicated. Cassie stayed for about an hour, talked more than everyone else combined as she always did, made Skylar laugh at least 4 times, and when she left, she hugged me at the studio door and said into my ear with a voice that was equally joking and completely sincere, "She's wonderful, Maya. I approve." I told her the important approval was mine, she said. Also, yes, but the best friend approval carries weight. In the late afternoon, with the Nashville winter sun already dropping fast the way it does in December, we ended up on the back garden bench with coffee that had replaced the sodas from Cassie's visit. Skylar had her knees pulled up to her chest, arms wrapped around her shins, looking at the garden with that expression of full presence I had come to treasure, because it meant she was nowhere else. I was beside her with my feet flat on the cold stone, elbows on my knees, looking at the same garden. She said without preamble, "I want to stay in Nashville." I did not say anything and waited for her to continue. She did. Not because of Liam or any contract. "I want to build something real here. The music scene is strong enough I can work well out of this city. And..." She paused for a moment that had weight. "I don't want to keep leaving a place that feels like where I'm supposed to be." I looked at the garden for a moment. Then I asked, "And where do you think you're supposed to be?" She turned to look at me with that directness of hers that always caught me before I was ready for it, which was every time. She said, "Here, in Nashville, near the studio, near you." I held those words for a moment before speaking. Then I said, "Then stay." What happened after that sentence I cannot describe without reducing it to something smaller than it was. It was not dramatic in a cinematic way. There was no swelling music and no choreographed moment. It was much simpler than that, and much more real. She put her hand over mine where it rested on the bench between us in a way I recognized from the morning in the studio, when we had cried together and everything shifted, that same calm and certain grip. I turned my hand over and laced my fingers through hers. We sat like that, looking at the winter garden with the last of the December light, going amber on the frost-edged plants, and indigo appearing in the studio doorway to investigate why we were sitting outside in the cold. Later that evening, after the dark had come in, and we had turned on the warm lamp inside and heated the leftover food my mother had sent home with me from Christmas dinner, Skylar went to her backpack and came back with the envelope containing all 11 letters. She set it on the table beside me without speaking. I looked at the envelope for a moment, picked it up. Inside were 11 different folds of paper, each one different, written on different dates across 3 months of September through November, in New York City nights when she could not fit what she needed to say into a text message. I read all 11 that evening at the studio work table with her sitting across from me, pretending to look at her phone, but looking at me over the screen every few minutes. When I finished the last one, I put all 11 back in the envelope with care and held it against my chest the way I had held the first one. And this time she was watching openly and did not hide her smile. I said, "You should have sent all of them." She said, "Now you have all of them." And that was true. And it was enough. New Year's Eve of 2019 arrived in Nashville with the particular cold that the city saves for the last night of December, the kind that makes your breath visible and turns the tips of your ears red within 2 minutes of being outside. A cold that felt nothing like the warm Goiânia midnight I had read about in everything I had researched about the city during those months when Skylar was filling my thoughts, before I had admitted she was filling my thoughts. Skylar had been booked for a New Year's Eve set at a smaller venue in the Gulch, an independent event, organized by a production company she had worked with before and trusted. Nothing connected to Liam or any obligation that preceded her decision to stay in Nashville. She had accepted the booking before leaving for New York, back when she did not yet know how things would be when she returned. Now she knew, and she was getting ready for it in the studio with that preparation ritual of hers that I had never seen up close before. I sat in the chair near the window and watched. She worked in silence, checking every cable twice, organizing the drives with the evening sets in the order she had planned, testing connections with the small portable mixer she used for preparation. She worked with a seriousness that was entirely different from any other version of her I knew. The woman who held a paintbrush like it might break and let her tongue slip out in concentration and laughed at her own paint disasters was the same person who moved through equipment setup with a precision that looked like instinct, but I understood by then was years of accumulated knowledge made automatic. Indigo observed the cables from a cautious distance. I stayed quiet, respecting the space that belonged to her. At some point, she looked up from the equipment and caught me watching. She did not seem bothered by it. She said, "You're doing the observing thing." I said I was. She said, "What do you see?" I thought genuinely before answering. I said, "I see someone who loves what they do, but doesn't let that be visible easily, who keeps it inside the preparation where most people never look." She held my gaze for a second, with an expression I could not fully classify. Then she looked back down at the cables and said quietly, "Nobody ever described it like that before." I did not add anything. Sometimes the right thing is to have said the thing and let it land without decoration. The show was at 10 in the evening, and I went with her, which was already different from every other show of hers I had attended during the year. Before, I had always arrived alone and found a spot in the crowd. This time I arrived with her, helped carry one of the equipment cases from the car, walked in through the artist entrance that she did not question whether I would use. There was an intimacy in that practicality that was new, and that I received with the awareness of someone who understands they are being given something that is not small. The venue was a renovated warehouse space in the Gulch with good bones and better lighting. An outdoor area at the back where people could step away from the music for a moment. A sound system that Skylar evaluated with a glance and approved with a small nod I caught because I was watching. She set up with the help of the sound technician she knew from previous shows, ran the sound check, adjusted levels. I stayed near the booth, and she glanced at me occasionally during the process with a quick look that was not insecurity, just verification, just confirming I was there. I was always there. Midnight arrived the way it does at a New Year's show, with the crowd counting down from 10 in that collective voice that belongs to no one person and everyone simultaneously, with the room exploding at 0 into embraces and confetti, and the particular noise of people choosing to be hopeful together one more time. Skylar was behind the equipment when the clock turned, her left wrist raised in the air with the small wave tattoo catching the colored stage light. The floor below her, a moving mass of people lit in gold and green and red from the venue lighting. I was standing near the booth, and when midnight hit, she looked up from the equipment and found me in the space with her eyes. Found me specifically in a room full of people in the first seconds of a new year. And she smiled, not for the room, for me, with the full smile that I had been storing since the first time I saw it on a back porch in Green Hills on a night I had not wanted to go out. After midnight and the confetti and the plastic champagne cups someone had distributed, I walked to the booth. She had her headphones around her neck between tracks, and when she saw me coming, she made room beside her without being asked. A simple shift of position that said, "You belong here," without using any words. I stood beside her for a stretch of time watching her work from close range, understanding more of what she was doing than I had before because she had explained things to me over months of conversations, seeing the small decisions she made in real time, the reads she took of the room, the adjustments she made before the floor knew it needed them. She explained a few things to me in a low voice without stopping working, pointing to a control here, describing a transition there. It was like hearing someone explain how they think. I listened with everything I had. The show ended close to 2 a.m. We packed the equipment together, said goodbye to the sound technician, thanked the production team. In the parking lot of the venue with the Nashville cold hitting properly after hours inside a warm building, she closed the trunk of the borrowed car and stood leaning against it, looking at me with that post-show expression I had learned to recognize. the particular mixture of adrenaline still moving through her, and the good emptiness that follows giving everything you have to a room full of people who received it. Her hair was loose and slightly damp from the heat of the evening's work, and her face had that openness it got when she was tired enough to have stopped managing what showed. She said, "Thank you for staying." I told her I had not stayed out of obligation. She said, "I know. That's why thank you." We stood in the empty parking lot for a moment with the sounds of the city's New Year celebration still audible in the distance, some late fireworks going off somewhere over the Cumberland. Then she said something that arrived with the simplicity of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment to be said. "Maya, I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer with what you actually feel, not what you think you should feel." I told her I would try. She looked at me directly with that directness of hers that had disarmed me every single time from the very first night. "Do you want us to be something real? With a name? With clarity? Without staying in the gray area of assuming we understand each other without ever having said it out loud?" I looked at her for a moment that was brief, because the answer had been ready for longer than I had known I was preparing it. I said, "Yes, I do." She was quiet for a second, as if letting that land completely. Then she leaned forward slightly and kissed me. Soft and unhurried. The kind of kiss that has no urgency in it because it knows it is not ending anything. It is beginning something. When we stepped back, the Nashville cold was exactly the same as it had been before. But everything else was different. January of 2020 arrived in Nashville with a clarity I was not accustomed to carrying. Not the clarity of someone who had resolved every difficult thing, because the difficult things were still there in the proportions that real life keeps them. My father still working through something that was taking the time it needed to take. Teresa still learning. The world outside still being the world outside with all of its opinions about who two women could or could not be to each other. But there was a different kind of clarity underneath all of that. The clarity of knowing what was real and what was mine, and not being afraid to hold it with both hands anymore. Skylar started looking for an apartment in Nashville in the first week of January. She had saved enough from the New York City contract to stabilize herself for several months while she rebuilt her local bookings and reestablished the connections she had let go quiet during the 3 months away. Liam called once that week with a new proposal, a touring residency across 3 cities in the southeast. Good money, well organized. She answered, listened, said she was not available, and ended the call with a brevity that she described to me afterward with a smile that knew exactly what it was doing. Liam did not call again. Some doors that you close with clarity stay closed. On a Thursday afternoon in the second week of January, we went together to look at an apartment she had found online, in a building 6 blocks from the studio, on the same street I walked every time I went to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings, a street with old oak trees that I knew well enough to recognize each one. She had asked me to come not for my approval, but because she wanted to know what I thought, which was a distinction that was small and very important. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, 2 bedrooms, a narrow back balcony with a view across the rooftops of East Nashville. When we walked in, she moved through the rooms the way she evaluated everything, opening windows, testing the light at different angles, knocking gently on walls for reasons I could not explain technically, but that seemed to mean something to her. On the balcony, she stood looking at the rooftop view for a long moment. Then she turned and asked, "What do you think?" I looked at the space and then at her and said, "I think there's room for a hammock." She laughed and signed the lease the following week. The empty apartment had that particular smell of fresh paint that newly available spaces carry, and in the first weeks it was filled gradually with the things Skylar brought and arranged with deliberate care. The equipment, the box of books she had shipped from New York, some plants she bought at the Saturday farmer's market as if she had always kept plants, but which I knew she had never attempted before. I helped her hang shelves on a Saturday afternoon, which involved considerably more disagreement about level and placement than any shelving project has ever deserved, and ended with both of us sitting on the bare apartment floor eating delivery pizza because neither of us had energy left for cooking after the shelf argument. Indigo, whom I had brought along for the occasion, explored every corner of the empty space with the focused seriousness of a professional assessor, and his investigation entertained us more than anything on any screen could have. It was on a Tuesday afternoon in January that my father came to the studio without calling first, the same way my mother had done in December, which told me either they had discussed it or it was a family trait I had not previously identified. He came through the garden gate with his usual posture, that of a man who was taught to occupy space carefully, and stood in the garden for a moment looking at the studio before going inside. Skylar was there. They saw each other at the same time, and the second that followed carried considerably more than its duration suggested. My father said good afternoon. Skylar said good afternoon, Pastor Gerald. He nodded. Then, in a voice I recognized as his making an effort he was not concealing, he said, I came to talk to Maya, but I am glad you are here too. That sentence stopped me completely. It was not declared acceptance, not the warm embrace I had sometimes imagined in the simpler versions of the future I allowed myself to picture. It was a man of 62 years saying out loud that there was room in that moment for both of us. And that was enormous coming from him. He stayed for nearly an hour. The conversation moved with the carefulness of people crossing new ground who know it and respect it. He asked Skylar questions about the music, about her plans for Nashville, about her family. She answered with the direct honesty she brought to everything, not adorning anything but not pushing either. At some point my father looked at the paintings on the studio walls and said, Maya has painted since she was very small. I never understood art well, but I understood that for her it was serious. He paused. I am trying now to understand more things that are serious to her. He did not look at either of us when he said it. But he did not need to. When he left, I walked him to the garden gate. We stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the January cold. He looked at me with the eyes that had always been my father's eyes, the same ones from when I was small and woke up sick in the night, and he sat beside my bed until I fell back asleep. The same ones from my first day of school and my graduation, and every moment that had mattered. He said, I love you, Maya. That has not been in doubt for one single day. I told him I knew. He said, I am learning. It will take longer than you deserve for it to take. But I am learning. I looked at him for a moment and then I hugged him, there on the sidewalk outside the studio, in the January cold of East Nashville with the oak trees bare above us and the street quiet around us. He held me back with a firmness I had not felt from him in a long time. Neither of us said anything more. We did not need to. I went back inside the studio carrying that particular weight that is not sadness and not happiness, but contains both inside it. Skylar was standing with her back to the room organizing brushes on the work table, which I knew was her way of giving space to a moment that was not hers, of being present without intruding. When she turned and saw my face, her expression read everything before I said a word. She did not ask how it had gone. She simply opened her arms slightly, a minimal gesture, an invitation without obligation. I went to her. We stood in the middle of the studio for a stretch of time I did not measure, with the winter light coming through the window and Indigo watching from the shelf, with that serene superiority that only cats can sustain. She said into my shoulder, He's going to get there. I said I thought so too. She said, Sometimes the people who love us most take the longest to understand us, because their love is too large to fit quickly around something new. I pulled back slightly to look at her. It was the wisest and most generous thing she could have said about my father in that moment. I asked where that had come from. She smiled at the side. My own mother. It took me a long time to understand it, but I did. I looked at her for a moment and then said, You are more than I deserve to find at a party I did not want to go to. She laughed quietly, that laugh I kept, and said, Good thing Cassie doesn't take no for an answer. February of 2020 arrived in Nashville with one of those mornings that the city produces sometimes in winter, as if by accident, the sky a particular shade of pale blue that belongs more to early spring than to February, a thin warmth in the late morning sun that was not enough to call warm, but was enough to notice. I woke early as always, made coffee, watered the plants on the back porch, talked to Indigo. The same routine as every morning. Except the same routine was entirely different in every small detail, because there was an extra mug on the shelf, and a pair of sneakers by the studio door that were not mine, and a playlist coming quietly through a phone that I had not chosen, and that was exactly what I wanted to hear. Skylar had stayed at the studio the night before, which had become a regular pattern on weekends when she did not need the apartment for equipment storage or the sound technician she had started mentoring twice a week. We had developed a natural geography between the two spaces without discussing it, her apartment as her professional base, and the studio as the place where the two of us existed together in the rhythm that had become ours. We had not negotiated any of that. It had organized itself the way things organize themselves when they are right. She appeared at the garden door with the mug she had made herself, her hair in the honest morning state, her feet bare on the cold stone of the garden which she had discovered was pleasant despite the temperature, because the stone held the coolness of the night until the sun reached it directly. She stood beside me looking at the garden without speaking for the right amount of time. Then she said, "Something is different in the garden today." I looked to find what she was seeing. There was a new frond on the fern in the clay pot by the gate, small and tightly curled, the kind that appears when a plant has quietly decided it is ready to grow further. I told her I had noticed it that morning. She said, "That's a good sign." I said I thought so too. That morning, I had arranged to call Cassie, who had questions about a painting she wanted me to look at for her, a piece she was considering buying from a local artist, which had started as a casual interest and become a genuine collecting habit over the past year. I called from the studio while Skylar was on the back balcony of the apartment 6 blocks away on a video call with the sound technician. Cassie answered with the energy of someone who had been awake for hours and was making use of every minute of it. She asked how I was. I said fine. She said, "No, Maya, how are you actually?" I paused and then said, "I'm happy, Cassie." 2 seconds of silence followed. Then she said, in a voice that had real emotion underneath the lightness she used for almost everything, "I know. I can see it. And it makes me so happy I get ridiculous about it." I laughed. She laughed. And then she said, "Take care of her, and let her take care of you too." I hung up carrying that sentence. In the early afternoon, I took out one of the large sketchbooks I used for preliminary work and sat at the studio work table. Skylar was on the garden hammock with her eyes closed, not sleeping, just existing with that capacity she had for complete stillness without absence. I opened the sketchbook to a blank page and began writing. Not a painting draft, not a composition sketch. I was writing the year. Not chronologically, not in any organized structure. Just the moments that had stayed, the sentences I did not want to lose, the small specific details that make a story real rather than general. The back porch conversation that first night, the first cold coffee we shared, her hands stained with every wrong color laughing at her own disaster, the rain audio she sent from New York, the painted garden with no return address, the sentence on the back that I will not write here because it is mine. My father's arms on the sidewalk, the 11 letters in the wooden box I had bought specifically to keep things that could not be lost. At some point, Skylar came in from the hammock and stopped in the studio doorway watching me write. I felt her arrive but did not look up immediately. She stood quietly for a moment and then asked softly, "What are you doing?" I said I was writing our story. She was quiet for a second. Then she came to the table, pulled the chair beside mine and sat down. She did not ask to read, did not lean over to see. She just sat beside me while I wrote, her elbow on the table and her chin in her hand looking out at the garden through the open window. and I kept writing with her beside me, and that was exactly how it needed to be. That afternoon, an unexpected message arrived. It was from Teresa, Skylar's mother, sent to the family message thread she and Skylar shared, which told me either that Teresa had composed it in a group setting intentionally, or that she had written it quickly before she could change her mind. The message was short and unpolished, in the way of something written in one breath, and sent before revision. It said, "Skylar, I would like to invite you and Maya to lunch on Sunday. I'm making the chicken you've always liked. Let me know if you can come." Skylar sat looking at her phone screen for a long moment without speaking. I had seen the message over her shoulder. She turned to me with an expression that carried inside it things from years back, from a relationship that had been difficult and real and full of love that was poorly communicated for a very long time. I said, "We're going." She said, "We're going," and sent the reply. On Sunday morning before Teresa's lunch, we stopped at my parents' house in Germantown to drop off a pie my mother had asked me to bring, a visit that was meant to take 20 minutes and became an hour because my father was in a good mood and wanted to show Skylar the small kitchen garden he had started in the backyard at the beginning of the year, a raised bed with herbs and some early greens he was trying for the first time. She went with him to look at it with a genuine attention that was not performed, asking real questions about what he was growing, why he had chosen those varieties, how he was managing the light exposure in that corner of the yard. I stood in the kitchen doorway with my mother watching my father explain the difference between herbs that needed full sun and those that tolerated shade to Skylar, who was crouching beside the raised bed, looking at the seedlings with the same focus she gave everything that interested her. My mother stood beside me and said nothing, but she put her arm through mine while we watched and held it there. At Teresa's apartment, the table was set for 3, which was a detail that arrived before anything else and said what it needed to say. She had made the chicken Skylar had loved since childhood, had bought 2 kinds of soda because she did not know which I preferred, had put out a tablecloth that felt like it was not the everyday one. During the meal, Teresa gradually opened the way people open when warmth reaches them slowly, and by the time dessert arrived, she was telling stories about Skylar as a child with a pleasure she could not contain. Skylar kept saying "Mom" in a tone that was equal parts protest and affection. Teresa looked at me sometimes during those stories with an assessment that was still present, but had lost the defensive edge of the earlier meetings. She was a woman learning to trust a process she had not chosen, but was choosing to accept. When we left, Teresa came to the door with us. She hugged Skylar with the hug that belongs to mothers who have years of distance and reconciliation packed into the physical fact of their arms. Then she turned to me. She looked at me for a moment with that directness I recognized as the trait Skylar had inherited without knowing it. Then she hugged me. Not the polite, careful hug of our first meeting. A real one. Brief and firm. The kind that does not need words because it has already said them. I thanked her in a way she understood was not about the lunch. On the walk back toward the studio, the February afternoon was doing something generous with the light. That late winter gold that arrives when the sun is low and the bare trees do not block it, and everything it touches looks like it was chosen carefully. Skylar walked beside me on the quiet residential street with her hands in her jacket pockets, and the particular silence that I had learned to read as contentment rather than absence. On a calm stretch of sidewalk near the studio, she took one hand out of her pocket and found my hand without looking, without saying anything, just found it and held it while we walked. I did not say anything either. We walked the last 2 blocks to the studio with our hands together, and the February light behind us, and the garden gate visible ahead, and nothing else that needed to be said. February of 2020 was ending in Nashville, with the particular quality of a city that has not yet decided to become spring, but has stopped being fully winter. That in-between state where the mornings are still cold enough to see your breath, but the afternoons carry a suggestion of warmth that makes you leave your heaviest coat at home and not regret it until 4 o'clock. I woke on a Thursday morning in the last week of the month before my alarm, before the coffee, before any of the rituals that structured my days, and lay in the dark for a moment, just aware of the specific texture of that particular morning. There was an extra mug on the studio shelf. There were sneakers by the door that were not mine. There was a playlist that had become as familiar to me as my own breathing, and outside in the garden, the fern by the gate had 3 new fronds now, small and curled, and entirely certain of themselves. Skylar had stayed the night before, and was still asleep on the studio couch when I got up to make coffee. Indigo a warm and immovable fact against her feet. I made the coffee quietly, stood at the garden window looking out at the February morning light on the frost-edged plants, and thought about the year that had brought me to this exact place. Not the year as a narrative with a beginning and an end, but the year as a collection of specific moments that had each been their own kind of irreversible. A back porch in Green Hills on a March night I had not wanted to be at. A first cup of cold coffee at a work table covered in paint. A playlist called Indigo. A painted garden mailed across state lines with no return address. A sentence on the back of a piece of notebook paper that I kept in a wooden box on the studio shelf and would keep for the rest of my life. She woke with the smell of the coffee as she always did, appeared in the kitchen doorway with her morning hair and her half-open eyes, and the specific expression of someone who has slept deeply and is taking their time about returning from it. I handed her the mug I had already filled. She took the first sip with her eyes still not fully operational, and made that sound of involuntary approval that I had long since stopped pretending not to find completely endearing. She noticed my expression and said, "Don't," I said. I didn't say a word. She said, "You were doing it with your face." And I went to the garden before she could see that I was still doing it with my face. We spent the morning the way the best mornings at the studio were spent, without agenda and without apology for having none. She settled into the garden hammock with a book. I painted near the open window with the music she had put on before going outside, drifting through the cold morning air. In the middle of the morning, she read something out loud without context because she thought I should hear it, and I responded without setting down my brush, and we went back and forth like that for a while, passing thoughts across the space between the window and the hammock as easily as passing something from one hand to another. I thought about the fact that this specific ease, this particular frequency of being together, was something I had not known was available to me before she arrived in my life. I had not known because I had not had the comparison. Now I had it, and I understood the difference between the quiet I had constructed as protection and the quiet that came from being genuinely at peace. In the early afternoon, Cassie called. The regular Thursday call that had become a standing feature of our week since the previous summer. She was in good form, full of energy, with news about a case at work that she walked me through in detail that I followed about 40% of, but listened to entirely, because listening to Cassie was one of the reliable pleasures of my life. At the end of the work update, she paused in a way that was intentional and said, "How are things?" Actually, I looked out the studio window at Skylar in the hammock with the book on her chest and the winter sun on her face. I said, "Cassie, things are good. Things are genuinely, actually good." She was quiet for a second that was not her usual filled silence. Then she said, "I know. I can hear it. It's in your voice and it's been there for weeks, and I just wanted to hear you say it." I smiled at the window. She said, "Okay, now tell me what she did that was funny this week because I need to live through you." After the call, I took out the large sketchbook from the shelf and opened it on the work table. The pages from the previous Sunday were still there, the writing I had done while Skylar sat beside me looking at the garden. The accumulated record of a year that had taken everything I thought I knew about myself and replaced it with something truer and harder won, and entirely more real. I read back through what I had written, not to edit it, but just to have it under my eyes again. And I thought about the fact that stories do not end the way they end in the versions we tell ourselves when we are afraid. They end the way this one was ending. Not with a resolution of every difficult thing, but with a place to stand that felt solid. With a person beside you whose presence made the solid ground feel larger. With the knowledge that the things still unresolved were being held by people who were trying, even when trying was slow and imperfect and cost something real. In the late afternoon, Skylar came in from the hammock, set her book on the shelf, and stood in the middle of the studio looking at the new canvas I had been working on all morning. It was the largest piece I had attempted in years, a composition that broke most of my own rules and followed none of the principles I taught my students, alive with colors I had spent the better part of the previous year learning I was allowed to use. She stood looking at it for a long time with her arms crossed and her head slightly tilted. Then she said, "That's the best thing you've made." I asked how she knew. She said, "Because it doesn't look like someone who is being careful. It looks like someone who stopped being afraid of the paint." She was right. I knew she was right before she finished the sentence. I set down the brush and stood beside her looking at the canvas we were both looking at, the two of us side by side in the warm lamplight of the studio, with the February afternoon outside the window, and Indigo making his way across the room toward his preferred evening position on the windowsill. She put her arm around my shoulders in a way that was easy and unhurried, and I leaned into it the way you lean into something that has become familiar enough to receive without thinking about it. We stood like that looking at the painting for a while. It was a completely ordinary moment. It was one of the best moments of my life. That evening we walked to the farmers market area for dinner, a new place that had opened on Gallatin Avenue that Cassie had been recommending for weeks with increasing urgency. The Nashville February evening was cold and clear, the kind of clear that makes the city lights sharper, and we walked the familiar blocks of East Nashville with our hands in our respective pockets, and our breath visible in the cold air, talking about small things the way people talk, when the large things have settled enough that the small things can have their turn. She told me about a new DJ she had been mentoring, who had played her first full set the previous weekend, and had called Skylar afterward in tears of relief and exhaustion and joy. I told her about a student who had come in for a beginner class that week, who had never held a brush in her life, and by the end of 2 hours had made something so genuinely beautiful that I had asked if I could photograph it. We talked about those things on a cold Nashville street, and they were the right things to be talking about. After dinner on the walk back, she took my hand the way she had taken it on the Sunday after Teresa's lunch, without announcement, just found it in the dark and held it. We were half a block from the studio when she stopped walking. I stopped beside her. She was looking up at the bare oak tree above us, with an expression I could not read in the dark. Then she looked at me and said, "Can I tell you something?" I said yes. She said, "I used to come home after every show and think that the night had been good because the room was good, or the music was right, or the energy worked out. And then I started coming home and thinking the night had been good because I was going to tell you about it." She paused. That was when I knew. I looked at her in the dark under the bare oak tree on the quiet East Nashville street. I said, "That was when I knew too." She smiled, the full smile, the one I had been keeping since a back porch in Green Hills almost a year ago, and I kept it again. We walked the last half block to the studio with our hands together, and I unlocked the garden gate, and she went through first the way she always did now, and stood in the garden for a moment, looking at the fern with the 3 new fronds by the gate, and the studio window with the warm light inside, and the whole quiet, particular life we had built in this space that had once been only mine, and was now ours in the way that the best things become ours, not by declaration, but by accumulation, by all, the ordinary mornings and cold coffees and paint-stained afternoons and difficult honest conversations and small unplanned gestures that add up over time to something that holds. I locked the gate behind us. Indigo appeared in the studio doorway as he always did when we came back, assessing the situation with the gravity he brought to all situations. The Nashville February night was cold and clear and going nowhere. Inside the studio, the lamp was warm, and the paint shelves were full, and the wooden box with 11 letters in it sat on the shelf where I had put it. I made coffee. She put on the playlist. And we were home.